Good evening and welcome to Coloradan Conversations. This evening, our topic is transforming treatment for mental health. I am Maria Kuntz. I'm the editor of the award-winning Coloradan Alumni Magazine, and I'm so glad to be here with all of you tonight. So thank you for joining us. We're excited to be hosting this event with some incredible CU experts and researchers. And we understand that it takes a lot of time and effort to prioritize this in your busy lives. So thank you for taking the time and making this part of your evening. For our virtual audience, I'd like to mention that this event is being closed captioned. So to access the captions, you can locate the CC button located on the right-hand side in the bottom toolbar of your Zoom window. Tonight, we will be discussing the topic of mental health, specifically the way CU researchers are pioneering new ways to diagnose and treat mental illness. Before we dig into this topic, I will read the CU Boulder land acknowledgement. The University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of Indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on Indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with Indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of Indigenous CU Boulder students, faculty, staff, and their work, educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating Indigenous knowledge, consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support, and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. If you would like to help uplift Indigenous and Native American voices, please consider giving to the Center of Native American and Indigenous Studies as a way to create opportunities for Native American students and educators alike. Whether you are new to Coloradan Conversations or you've attended all of them for the past 2 years, I'd like to share a little about the Coloradan Alumni Magazine and these events. 3 times a year, we send out the Coloradan Alumni Magazine to over 300,000 Forever Buffs. That's via mail and via email. And in return, you call us and you send us incredible letters and emails. You've shared memories about your experience on campus. You tell us about reconnecting with classmates, and you celebrate along with your other fellow Forever Buffs. So these stories are a springboard to engage in conversations with the university about challenging and thought-provoking topics. But these conversations are happening in email and phone calls, so we decided to create conversations like these that gather Forever Buffs, CU's world-class faculty, students, alumni, and community members to stir intellectual curiosity and to begin to build the foundation for taking action on important issues of today. We launched Coloradan Conversations in partnership with the CU Boulder community, Chancellor Philip DeStefano, the Alumni Association, and the Coloradan Magazine in 2021. Tonight's event is our 6th conversation. So we believe that powerful conversations coupled with knowledge and action can fuel change. Thank you for joining us and your fellow Forever Buffs for this conversation. Tonight's event dives into an important issue that impacts people around the country and here on campus. Mental health is declining in America. According to Mental Health America's 2023 reported data, nearly 20% of adults experienced a mental illness in 2019, and 4.8% of adults have had serious thoughts of suicide. But since the start of the pandemic, it's been clear that in particular, the young adult population in the US is struggling. Over 16% of youth have experienced a major depressive episode, and over 2.7 million youth have severe depression, and it's estimated that more than half of them will not receive treatment. Chancellor DeStefano is committed to prioritizing mental health for the CU Boulder campus community and beyond. Last fall, the university's Renee Crown Wellness Institute officially opened their new space with programs centered on helping youth get the support they need. Last week, alumnus Jeremy May announced a very generous 3-pronged gift to support mental health and wellness at CU Boulder. And in the latest issue of the Coloradan, we explored how CU researchers are finding new ways to diagnose and treat mental illness using collaborative approaches and cutting-edge techniques in brain imaging, genetics, and telemedicine. Tonight, we're excited to share more about this work with you. So before we get started, I want to make one more point before I introduce our first speaker. This is the first time during a Coloradan conversation that we're featuring 2 exhibits during our in-person reception after the event. So they might just wave their hands so you can see who they are in the audience now. Inside You has a few people here, and that's a collaborative project with Pixar Animation. And they took inspiration from the film Inside Out to build an educational tool that seeks to improve mental health among children. The second exhibit, Mood Sync, I see them in the back over there, thank you, is a project led by researchers in the Department of Information Science to create a smartphone app that allows individuals managing mental illness to track mood changes, monitor symptom trends, and identify potential triggers by collaborating with members of their close support networks. So thank you to our exhibitors for coming to the event, and I hope that those of you who are able to stay after will take the time to engage with them. This evening, we're joined by 4 CU researchers, and our experts study mental health in their respective fields. Our first speaker is Dr. June Gruber. Dr. June Gruber is a licensed clinical psychologist, associate professor of psychology and neuroscience at CU Boulder, and director of the Positive Emotion and Psychopathology Laboratory. Her research includes positive emotion and reward-related disturbance in psychopathology, and she co-leads a call to action center on the mental health crisis sparked by the COVID-19 pandemic. She has won many awards, including but not limited to the Association for Psychological Sciences Rising Star Award and the Janet Taylor Spence Award for Transformative Early Career Contributions. She's given a TED Talk with thousands of views on the dark side of happiness and leads an online Coursera course called #TalkMentalIllness, an accessible learning experience to help people have conversations about mental health. Please welcome to the stage Dr. June Gruber.
Thank you so much for such a warm introduction, and I'm really honored to be starting off a lovely speaker series, kind of touching on distinct domains of much needed attention to mental health. What I hope to talk today is really to kind of at a broad level signal and enhance this much needed call to action and echo the need to reimagine mental health during and enduring through and beyond COVID. Indeed, mental health sciences must address the challenges we're facing and to reimagine a new way to approach them. What I'll do is I'll start with a roadmap, and on this roadmap, I will start with a call to action, as mentioned, kind of motivating field-wide calls to really issue a mobilizing need that involves collaboration among many stakeholders. Second, I want to share a little bit about what we know. So what are the lessons the pandemic has taught us thus far about mental health, and the ways in which they didn't always go the way we expected, and how we're humbled in how much we need to learn still, and with the need for science to do so. And finally, really kind of moving forward as to what are actionable steps that we can all do to engage in to truly re-envision a healthier mental landscape, particularly for young people. So I'll start with a call to action. And here in particular, what I want to highlight is what has been so unique about the pandemic that persists through today. And part of it is that it's looked very different from any stressor we've previously encountered. It's had what we call a multi-dimensional or multi-prong impact. It has involved truly high-stakes stressors. It's been involved uncertainty, disruption to daily routines, and has been chronic in nature. it has been widespread. We can't really narrow it down to one particular system it's affected because it's permeated all of them. And everyone here can probably resonate with that across individual, educational, medical, political systems. It's really kind of permeated across our societal fabric. And as a clinical psychologist, the part that sort of echoes most strongly is the extreme vulnerability people have been left in. We know as psychologists that one of the kind of key buffers to kind of promote mental wellness and safeguard against the onset or severity of clinical symptoms is social support. Now, the very thing we did early on was to sort of remove social interaction during social distancing and cause ruptures to those safeguards. And here we are, some years later, still trying to repair those social ties, still trying to, as we talk about on campus, rebuild community. And so in many ways, that's the key part of what we need to be considering too, is how to bring back in those safeguards. And it's not surprisingly, as was mentioned in the introduction, the US Surgeon General also issued a crisis with respect to mental health with a particular focus on the young people. So we see that there was a general kind of response to the pandemic in terms of mental health changes, but with young people, they've not yet returned to their pre-pandemic baseline. And so it's for this very reason my research team is focused a lot on the young adults, or what we call emerging adults, who are at a vulnerable time of life transition and identity development and sort of mapping out their future careers, and at the same time are also one of the most vulnerable groups right now. For this reason, my colleagues and I issued a call to action with over 30 other clinical psychologists and scientists and mental health professionals, saying that it was our public responsibility in the time of COVID to use this important window to identify challenges, opportunities, and a path ahead. So what did we learn from this? In other words, what do we know? The way that I try to think about what we know about COVID is that we're still learning, right? It's an ongoing, evolving process. But I think about 4 general mental health themes that summarize at least key pieces that COVID has taught us. The first one really stems from work in my lab, and with my students here, including Luisa Rosa, who I can see back there, is the importance of context. And I'll show you one way in which we think about context. So we have a long-term project where we've been sampling CU Boulder students, as well as some students from our partnering institutions at the US and internationally, and we have been following them. It started as a project focused on the college mental health crisis in fall 2019 when we thought things were looking pretty dire, and then the pandemic hit on an already kind of precarious foundation. So it became this pre-COVID baseline through which we've been tracking students over time. What was interesting is when we initially looked at students' mental health symptoms during that initial COVID outbreak, so when the university was shut down for all in-person instruction, when many of our lives abruptly changed, we wondered how students' mental health was faring. What we found initially was surprising. So we did not see changes in depression at the beginning, and we wondered what might be going on. And we realized that not all students are a one-size-fits-all story, not surprisingly, but that we had to probe more deeply into the context of what COVID looked like for them. So we had these contextual questions of, to what extent was the pandemic at that time impacting their financial stability, their social resources, and even their own physical health. At that time, had they contracted the virus, had someone close to them, to what extent were they kind of in a high-risk group? And not surprisingly, when we partition these participants into this COVID risk index of high and low, for those students who at that point had COVID permeating their life, they were showing increases in depression, whereas the rest weren't yet. And so we saw similar trends for anxiety. Some students actually showed some dips and others showed no changes. And we started to see that maybe at that point it was a different story for different students early on. And this is where we wondered, but what happens when COVID no longer is an acute stressor and we're doing this rapid mobilization, but now it's become a chronic stressor? What does that look like? We certainly know that humans deal much better with acute stressors that have a beginning and end than chronic stressors without any sort of reprieve. So we realized if we widen our time aperture, timing is really critical. So we've been following these students over time, and I'll show you an example from just even fall 2020, right? That we start to see the long haul, so to speak, mental health impact of COVID emerging. And now across all students, we see general trends for depression worsening over time, anxiety worsening over time, and decreases in life satisfaction. We're currently underway looking at this now. We just completed a 3-year follow-up because our concern is that the ability to cope with chronic stressors is one of the things that is leaving our young people most vulnerable. And so COVID has taught us that the timing is critical. But with all this, humans are still a remarkably resilient species. They're one and both true at the same time, and resilience does happen. This beautiful work by George Bonanno, who wrote a book, The End of Trauma, he notes that many people who suffer difficult losses exhibit a natural resilience. They hurt deeply, but for many, the hurt may pass, and relatively soon after the loss, they can resume functioning and enjoy life. Our lab right now is sort of working hard in fundraising to actually probe into this kind of ingredients of resilience. Because not only does it help us to know what do these resilient students look like, but can we learn lessons from them to help the students who are struggling, right? To kind of share and sort of, leverage those kind of secrets of resilience to help all students. And with all this, disparities exist and are continuing to be persistent and deep. And in particular, we're seeing grave mental health disparities affecting our young people who identify from historically underrepresented and marginalized groups. One of the projects we're working on launching is led by a grad student in my lab, Cynthia Villanueva, with a true interest in looking at mood difficulties during times of stress among Latinx young adults to try to better understand the unique experiences and trajectories among diverse college student samples. Luisa Rosa, who I also mentioned, is interested in exploring this further, doing work among adults as well from Brazil, and we've done some work among young adults from India, really realizing that if we're gonna understand young people's mental health, we need to understand it among all young people. So we also pay a lot of attention in our lab just to addressing inequities for underrepresented women, both in the science we do, the people we study, and the way we treat those in the field that we're part of. So it's been a real passion to really make efforts towards supporting women in the sciences and all of this. So I'll conclude my last couple minutes with what can we do? I think of 4 broad arms to this, or aims, of really trying to get in there and tackle campus wellness. The first thing that really permeates it all is like our mental mindset about mental health or illness, and that we must really work hard towards destigmatizing it. One of the efforts that was kindly mentioned that was sparked by the pandemic and the need to sort of literally talk about mental illness, to normalize it and destigmatize it, is this free interview series. Anyone can watch it here at Boulder or in the broader community, and it's really conversations with the leading scientists who study treatment, who study suicide, who study racism in the context of mental health, to those who also study the science of happiness and wellness, and what can we learn from them, as well as public figures like Temple Grandin or Kay Jamison, if any of you have read their books, but that we all need to join this conversation if we're really going to change the way we approach mental health. We also need to empower all of us with science. I think of the science of happiness because it's quite fascinating. We have a kind of obsession with happiness, especially in the US, and we think we know what makes us happy, and we spend a lot of money. There's an industry behind this. But yet, if we look to cognitive science, we know that sometimes our intuitions are wrong. The human mind doesn't always make rational decisions. We're sometimes maybe better wired to survive and reproduce than to know what makes us happy. And so we can look to science for intuitions, and this is something I've been really trying to move into mainstream campus community by offering a new class this semester. I see one of my students here. We've been talking about the science of a meaningful life, right, and the science of wellness, and been creating resources through this course that then we can disseminate to the broader community as well. We need to provide support. I work here as a faculty fellow at the Center for Teaching and Learning in the same building, one floor under, because we need to support our students and those who teach our students to know how to respond when mental health challenges come up in class. Many instructors, faculty, and TAs want resources, need resources, and we need to help support them so they can support our students as well. Last but not least, if we're going to make any headway here, we need to learn, we need to support science, because otherwise we're not going to know what to do. We're not going to have the lessons to take us where we need to go. So our lab has been working with students because, as we said in this article, we want the students themselves to tell us how they're feeling so that we can have a better pulse of the mental health of students on campus. If you're just supporting our work, it's among emerging adults. I can tell you more about it. We're in the kind of phases of launching some new directions I mentioned. Happy to chat more. But at the end of the day, and why I joined this field, I remember being an undergraduate, wide-eyed, interested in understanding the mind and mental health. I had this lofty goal of making the world better, and I think at the end of the day, you come back because why are we here? We're here to understand mental health or psychological science for the goal of making the world the part we can healthier, happier, and more sustainable. So thanks for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Gruber. Our next speaker is Courtney Kelly. Courtney Kelly is a CU Boulder psychology alumnus with a minor in sociology. During her time at CU, she held several volunteer and internship roles in the Boulder and Denver communities. Additionally, she was an undergrad researcher and volunteer on several Renee Crown Wellness Institute research projects. In May 2020, she was awarded the Barry and Sue Bayer Scholarship for undergraduate research after she completed her honors thesis and graduated magna cum laude. Through her time as a researcher with the Crown Institute, she has several collaborative scientific publications in preparation. Currently, Courtney is a senior project manager and professional research assistant at the Crown Institute with the Mindful Campus program and the Girls Like Us program. Through her research and community engagement, Courtney continues to advocate for accessible mental health resources while integrating this with mindfulness-based practices in her community and education. Please welcome Courtney Kelly.
All right. Hello, everyone. Again, welcome, and thank you so much for being here today. It is my absolute honor to talk to you about the Renee Crown Wellness Institute's Mindful Campus program. Let's get started. So before we dive into the program, first we must explore the why. Why did we see the need for relevant and accessible programming for young adults in college? As mentioned earlier, students' levels of stress and anxiety is on the rise. Between the years of 2008 and 2018, the percentage of students reporting mental health issues nearly doubled. Programs and interventions that incorporate mindfulness and other contemplative skills are promising interventions to promote well-being. So I'm going to ask you to take a little journey with me. So imagine if there were mindfulness-based interventions designed by contemplative experts, researchers, and the very students they're intended to serve. Well, I'm elated to have this opportunity to share with you all today a program we developed and studied with that very intention in mind, which we call the Mindful Campus program. The Mindful Campus team was designed by CU Boulder students, faculty, and staff members with the aim of developing and sharing sustainable and accessible mindfulness-based practices campus-wide. As you will see here, here's a representation of some of our past and present Mindful Campus team members. As we can see, we have community members, graduate students, undergraduate students, faculty, all coming together with a shared vision. At the Crown Institute, how we work is just as important as what we do. So as we go through this presentation today, I'm going to show you how our program came to be by going through our design cycles. Our program consisted of the following 5 design cycle phases. Our first one, as showing earlier, was build trusted teams. Our second phase, youth participatory action research. Our third phase, co-design. Fourth phase, evaluate and refine. And our fifth phase, scale and sustain. After building trusted teams, we engaged in an intensive process of youth participatory action research, also known as YPAR. This phase is very near and dear to my heart, as this is where I started on the Mindful Campus program as a CU undergraduate on the Youth Participatory Action Research team. This, our YPAR project, undergraduate students partnered with university researchers to mobilize their diverse forms of expertise and collectively generate public knowledge that contributes to social justice change. The production of YPAR is to democratize knowledge production and enable action. Faculty, graduates, and undergraduate students come and work together in a process of collective, self-reflective inquiry. And as you can see, some of our key values of YPAR are equality, transparency, support, and empowerment. One other key piece of the Mindful Campus program is that while undergraduates were the community in which we were aiming to serve, they were also co-researchers. Learning from the YPAR project, we entered our next phase, which is the third phase, co-design, where we did this deep dive in analyzing all of our data. We identified our campus needs, opportunities, and created our now innovative 8-week program through this process of participatory co-design. In this co-design process, we had the honor of receiving training in various mindfulness approaches, including compassion cultivation training. As you will see here, all smiles, our team is very grateful that we had the opportunity to learn and train with Dr. Tupton Jimpa, who is standing second from the left here. Now, so we've spent the last 2 years in our implementation and iteration phase. We conducted a study of 124 participants and are excited to share that statistically significant differences observed in symptoms associated with depression, anxiety, perceived stress, and loneliness. Based on those results, we're excited. We get really excited in this research. Excited. We're excited to engage in the scale and sustain phases. So in this phase, thinking really deeply about how can we reach all students on the CU Boulder campus and beyond campus. These are just some of the ways in which we're expanding the reach of the Mindful Campus program. So on the very left here first, you'll see groundbreaking research. We are planning to develop and study an accredited course that teaches about mindfulness, compassion, and social justice to support undergraduate wellness. Our next leaf is innovative programs, where we have established a weekly community of practice. Third, the very center in the top, you'll see mentoring. We've had various other research projects supported from this Mindful Campus program. And we continue today to support student research, train past Mindful Campus participants to serve as peer leaders of the program. As well, we have partnered with the Dalai Lama Fellows Program to offer unique leadership opportunities for undergraduates. Fourth, you'll see academic courses. We are working towards co-designing an accredited semester-long class and begin to sustainably integrate curricular offerings into the CU Boulder campus as well as the Crown Institute. Last but not least, we have campus culture. We're offering a speaker series right now for this 22-23 academic year in which we're inviting mindfulness leaders, both local and national, to come and speak on our campus. Like I said, we get excited, super excited about what is possible when you can develop mindfulness-based interventions that are relevant, engaging, and supportive to all students. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Courtney. Finally, we have Amelia Moser and Elisa Stern. Amelia is a PhD student in clinical psychology and neuroscience at CU Boulder. She graduated from Tufts University with a BS in clinical psychology, and she came to CU Boulder to pursue her interest in the development and treatment of adolescent psychopathology. She is particularly excited by the prospect of identifying predictors and mechanisms of successful treatment outcomes, with the goal of developing more informative, evidence-based care for teenagers. Elisa Stern is a PhD student in clinical psychology and neuroscience with a concentration in behavioral genetics at CU Boulder. Stern's research focuses on integrating neuroscientific and genetic methods to better understand the complex factors that can contribute to psychopathology onset and comorbidity risk. She graduated from Colby College in 2017 with a bachelor's in psychology and neuroscience and received a master's in developmental neuroscience from Yale University in 2020, where she continued to work for 2 years prior to attending CU. Welcome, Amelia and Elisa.
All right, thank you so much for having us. We're really excited to be here. So Elisa and I are going to be talking about harnessing interdisciplinary tools to advance mental health and treatment accessibility. And we wanted to start with talking about the landscape of 2023, and I know a lot of this has already been talked about, but even before the start of the pandemic, over the last decade, there's been a rising mental health crisis, increasing rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide attempts, especially among young adults, but also just across the general, broader population. And this is happening amidst a backdrop of broad treatment inaccessibility. People can't afford treatment, or they don't have health insurance, or there aren't enough providers. And if they do find treatment, the first treatment they try may not be effective for them. They might have to try multiple medications or multiple therapies before they get symptom relief. And for us as researchers, this poses really important questions about how we can do a better job of understanding the underpinnings of mental health problems and how we can do a better job of personalizing treatment options for people. And this is something that CU is really well equipped to tackle.
So building on Amelia's last point, I really just wanted to highlight what she said about CU being well positioned to do a lot of this work. And I think largely that's because interdisciplinary research is so central to the type of research that gets done at CU. Mental health and psychiatric illness is complicated and not something that can necessarily be tackled by one discipline or department alone. And so there are so many interdisciplinary departments and institutes at CU. The Renee Crown Institute, like Courtney mentioned, the Institute of Cognitive Science, the Institute of Behavioral Genetics, which I'll speak about in a little bit, and even departments like integrative physiology and information science, like the exhibit outside, all really come together to collaborate to answer some of these questions. On a more personal note, Amelia and I chose to come to graduate school here at CU because of the really unique opportunity to pursue graduate study in clinical psychology and neuroscience simultaneously, which is very unique. So I think it's safe to say that interdisciplinary work is woven into the fabric of how research is done here at CU, which is really exciting.
And Elisa and I are both coming from research on affective disorders and development lab here at CU, which is headed up by Dr. Rosie Kaiser. And broadly, we're interested in investigating adolescent wellness with advanced multimodal techniques. And what we mean by that is pulling from a broad range of methodologies like neuroimaging, blood work, cognitive assessments, comprehensive clinical symptom assessments, and even at-home surveys looking at things like stress or sleep difficulties to really try to get a comprehensive picture of what's going on for our participants and what do their lives look like. And our overarching focus is on predicting and tracking the development of mental illness, as well as factors that contribute to positive treatment outcomes. How can we better understand who's going to have mental health problems and who's going to benefit most from treatments? So one project I'm especially interested in working on in the lab is looking at kind of a precision medicine approach, or this idea of more personalized, more individualized medicine. We know that mental health problems are extremely heterogeneous. Presentations of even one singular disorder like depression can look really, really different. And so we're trying to better pull apart or tease apart different aspects of different factors of having depression. What do neural signatures look like? What does brain activation look like? Cognitive patterns, to try to better understand what treatment might work for what individual and how we can do a better job of personalizing that treatment process. And what's changing in the brain when people get better. Another study that's happening in the lab that's kind of trying to expand on that is looking at cannabidiol. We know that a lot of people in the community are using cannabidiol, or CBD, to self-treat symptoms of depression. But we really don't know if cannabidiol helps depression. It just hasn't been looked at yet. And so one thing our lab is trying to do, along with Dr. Bidwell, is looking at CBD use in folks with depression and tracking them over time. What changes in the brain over time when people with depression take CBD? What changes cognitively? How do symptoms change? Are people improving? And the idea is we want to better understand these kind of more scalable, potentially more accessible therapeutics and see, are they actually helpful? And kind of how can we better facilitate that process of recovery?
So coming back to our theme of interdisciplinary work, I'm going to ask you to shift gears with me for a second. And I'm going to talk about the Institute of Behavioral Genetics and add a bit of a genetic lens. So the Institute of Behavioral Genetics is an institute here at CU that, probably no surprise, focuses on behavioral genetics and genetics more broadly. And behavioral genetics as a research field is really the study of how genetic variation can lead to differences in phenotypes or traits. And these phenotypes can can be anything from psychiatric illness to cognitive ability to a whole host of other psychological and behavioral factors. Behavioral genetics really allows us to get at the age-old question of nature versus nurture and really try and understand how biological predispositions work in concert with somebody's environmental experience to contribute towards the onset of something like psychiatric illness, for example, is what I'm interested in. And at IBG, researchers use a whole host of genetically informed methodologies, including genome-wide association studies, or GWAS, as you may have heard, biometrical modeling, pharmacogenetics, which is done more so in the model organism or animal research side, which I'm not going to get into today, and also family and twin-based designs. And unlike some of the studies that Amelia was talking about with research that's being done in the rad lab, genetic research takes much larger sample sizes. So we're talking in the thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. And what that means is that oftentimes study sites will collaborate with other study sites to make sure that there's adequate sample size. And because IBG, or the Institute of Behavioral Genetics, is a nationally recognized and well-renowned research institute, it's consistently selected as a study site for several notable large-scale consortium studies. So if you're familiar with this field, you may have heard of the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study, or ABCD, or the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health. And what these data sets do is they collect a much larger amount of information, not necessarily as focal on, say, depression or CBD, but what that allows researchers to do is then go in with more focused questions because the data is more broad. So one of the questions that I'm looking at is looking at whether or not adolescent cannabis use, for example, can predict early adult suicidality. Another one of my lab mates has looked at a question looking at associations between different parenting characteristics and adolescent substance use. So the world's kind of our oyster, and it's fun to conduct research in this field as well. Bringing it all together, I wanted to highlight this field of neuroimaging genetics. As the name would imply, this field refers to the integration of genomic and imaging data to investigate mechanisms that underlie brain phenotypes and neuropsychiatric disorders. So putting together all of the things that have kind of been said, if you think about how genetic variation can potentially lead to different brain connectivity patterns or just the differences in brain development, maybe we can use those functional connectivity patterns to try and understand a little bit more of what Amelia was talking about with precision medicine and different characteristics. One such study or collection of studies that's being done at IBG in this field is looking at executive function and imaging genetics. So this is kind of where we see, or where I see at least, the future of these two fields coming together, and it's an exciting place to be.
So kind of summing things up, we feel really strongly that a more comprehensive understanding of the pathophysiology of mental illness, how it comes to develop, and treatment personalization is just really urgently needed. Interdisciplinary team science is going to be the only way to answer these questions. These are not questions that one researcher in one lab, in one department is going to be able to answer. We need experts from a variety of fields to come together and create a much more nuanced understanding of what's going on. And CU is just really at the forefront of this research space and just really uniquely well positioned to answer these questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Amelia and Elisa. I'm going to welcome Courtney and June to join us at the stage. And at this time, we're going to transition into some question and answer. We're going to have questions for those of you who are online and here in the audience. I've got a few questions for all of our presenters. And we're going to benefit from both types of kind of conversation. I would just want to remind everyone that if you didn't receive one in the mail and you're here tonight, you should have a copy of the magazine. This is the fall 2022 issue of the Coloradan Alumni Magazine. It's fully accessible online as well, and that is sort of was the foundation for tonight's event and the topic. So I'm guessing that many of you here tonight and online probably had a few questions before we got started, and now you might have even a few more. So let's get started with an audience question. We're going to ask you one, and then we're going to have open Q&A later. Reflecting on what you heard tonight, or maybe what you read in the Coloradan, how has the conversation around mental health changed for you since the COVID-19 pandemic? So I'm going to invite those of you online to enter some answers in the chat, and then we have a mic here for those of you who are here in person.
Would anybody like to share in the audience? I'll bring the mic to you.
I know it's a big question, but if you are willing to share, like maybe it's a conversation you had with a neighbor or a friend, or you're just here tonight because you're more curious to learn about mental health and wellness.
Okay. Cool.
I've got one online, so I'm going to start there, and then I see someone in the audience who's here with us too. This is a question for the presenters, so I'm going to hold that first. If you'd like to stand up and share with.
All right. My name is Jacob Kinsey. I'm a student, and I guess when COVID first started, I definitely had a lot of depressive moments for sure, and it felt like I don't know, no one really acknowledged it, I guess, and it was tough to say that I was having these episodes, and so. I don't know. It was just I feel like people really didn't think about it that much. And now, looking at all the research now, it's I feel like if COVID happened now, I'd be okay, I'd actually talk to people about it more, about those episodes I'm having. So definitely.
Thanks for sharing. Yeah. Anyone else? I see a hand. We've got someone here.
Hi, my name's Joni Mendolia. I'm a student therapist, marriage and family therapist at Regis University. I did my undergrad here at CU Boulder in sociology. And I think for me, thinking about the beginning of the pandemic, it was interesting to watch how people reacted to everything. Some people didn't react, some people really reacted, some people acted. So that was really interesting to see that kind of happen. For me personally, I kind of used that time as an opportunity to work on things in my life that I wanted to change. And then I noticed that over the span of those 2 years, it was almost like 2020 was like, okay, like it's survival mode, we're gonna do this, we're working with change. And then as 2021 came, I could see the burnout in a lot of people and how people just really started to kind of dwindle in their mental health. So it'd be really interesting to look at some more of the resiliency factors of how we deal with change and how we sustain our ability to move forward. So thank you.
Thanks for sharing and thanks for coming tonight. Oh, and I see a hand here. Let's do one more.
Hi, my name is Nosa Ogafo, and a second-year MBA student. I'm just curious, after looking at the last presentation, I'm curious to know what the role of CRISPR is in solving behavioral mental health issues. Thank you.
So if I heard that correctly, what is the role of CRISPR in solving behavioral mental health issues?
Yes, ma'am.
Are one of you ready to jump in?
I'm assuming that's geared towards me. To be honest with you, I don't really know how gene modification, so CRISPR is used to modify, genetic code to make it really simple. I'm not sure. My head immediately goes to like ethical considerations with going in and modulating DNA for something like mental health. I don't have a clear answer for you. I'm sorry. I definitely have not done that research myself, but I would be skeptical and careful about the ethical considerations of using CRISPR on something like psychological well-being, because there's still so much we don't know about like the genetics that underlie many mental health disorders. And, there's a whole field of something called candidate gene work. There doesn't seem to be one gene that like contributes to somebody developing, schizophrenia or depression or anything like that. And so is this on? Yeah. I don't know. I would be surprised if CRISPR is being used in that way, because psychiatric disorders are now what we think of as a complex phenotype. So there are tons and tons of different genes that all contribute in small ways to the onset of something like, really any disorder. And so, does that answer your question? Hopefully that's a little, okay. I'm happy to talk to you more about it later. I can think a little bit more while we're asking the rest of them.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, sorry.
No, that's wonderful. Thanks everyone for getting the conversation started. Oh, do you have one here? Okay, great. I think Julianne's bringing you a mic.
Julianne knows I don't need a mic.
It's for the audience who's online. They need to hear you.
Hi, my name is Robert Tremblay, and my wife and I publish 50 Plus Marketplace News, which is an information resource for seniors. And I must say that I would not have been able to comprehend the impact that this has had on small businesses in this Front Range. You have not even begun to see the impact of this yet. Many of these merchants struggled for years in family businesses to keep them running. They funded them through their savings, mortgaging their homes to the hilt and all kinds of things. And this is all going to come back to roost. We've got to address this thing, and it is, I can honestly say mental health is the focus of all of this improvement that life is going to take on, and it needs to happen sooner than later, in my opinion. So thank you.
Thank you. All right, so we have a couple questions pre-planned for our panelists. So I'd like to start by asking, and hopefully you can all weigh in, but we know there can be a lot of information and misinformation and stigma around discussing mental health. And so I'm curious if you could share, what's a misconception that concerns you when you're discussing your work with folks? Do you want to start?
Sure.
Yeah.
There's a handful of misconceptions, but one that really stands out to me and that we often encounter in the work we do among people with severe mood difficulties is this assumption that people with these lived experiences have the inability to effectively manage their emotions, when in fact what science has told us is far from that. That we find in our studies in the lab and in the world that if we ask people and describe different ways to manage their emotions, whether they're using different cognitive techniques or different acceptance techniques, they do a beautiful job. And in fact, it's teaching people less about skills that they don't have, which they do, but more about how to implement them in the real world. So in many ways, we've been thinking about this and writing about this as an effort to raise awareness about mental health that's aimed towards destigmatizing the assumption that people with serious clinical disorders have some sort of deficit in their ability to manage. Far from that, it's just we need to do a better job in teaching them how to help, take the skills they already have and maximize their own potential in real life. A challenge for all of us, certainly. Yeah. So that's something that's been on our mind a lot.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Do you want to go down we could go down the road. Courtney, do you have a misconception that folks have or a question that you get commonly when people are wanting to know more about your work?
Yeah, I think another misconception is that healthcare and mental health resources are just easily accessible for everyone right now, and that's not always the case. I think there's this misconception that people don't want to get help or they're scared to get help or whatever it is, but if we look at history and look at different communities, there's some fair reason to provide communities are more hesitant to get help from the medical field and they go elsewhere. They go to their churches or people that they personally know. And so I think the misconception there is that these mental health resources are just easily accessible for everyone because we talk about mental health, but that's not necessarily the case.
Something that comes to mind for me is just this idea that mental health disorders all look one canonical or stereotypical way. I think, hopefully we've convinced you that mental health disorders are so heterogeneous, even when you're talking about something like depression or something like anxiety, how it manifests for different people is going to look so different. And I wish that there was more of a conversation about the fact that you might not know that somebody is struggling with something, but they really are. Yeah.
I agree with everything that's been said. I think the only thing I would add is I think there's a misconception that, that these are rare, that mental health problems only affect a small number of people, or that people are few and far between. And I think a lot of people that are struggling with mental health problems can feel really alone in that. And I know that's something that someone in the audience said too. And I think just talking about it more and just acknowledging that this is something that's going to touch many of our lives is really important.
Yeah, thank you all for sharing and weighing in on that. All right, I've got the next question, and I know that you touched on this quite a bit, but maybe each person tonight, it was evident from the presentation that the work is interdisciplinary. I saw, slides with 20 and 30 faculty involved in projects. I'd love to hear each of you talk about why are interdisciplinary approaches important and what's gained from doing that? You want?
Sure.
Please, yeah.
Order. The human mind is incredibly complex, and I think the more we study it, from being undergraduate psychology students to wherever it takes us during the year, it's humbling in terms of just how much is going on. We look at emotions, and when we study emotions, we're humbled by the fact that it's no one thing. It's our subjective experience. So we work with linguists, we work with people from the arts and humanities to understand what does it feel like to have an emotion. It's also something we show in our face, and so we're looking at behavioral coding and these computing models to try to get at what's happening when people are experiencing an emotion. And then it gets more complex when you get in the body, and you've got the central nervous system and peripheral, and we're trying to get at all these multi-level approaches to find out what's happening in the brain and what's happening in the body. And so it's daunting, but it's exciting, and I think just as a field that studies feelings and studies them among people with experiences of mental distress or difficulties, it's impossible to do it alone, and no one would want to do it alone. Some of the most exciting conversations and discoveries we have are with our friends in computer science, or our friends in art and art history, or our friends in philosophy. I think we just have so much to learn about the human mind and body, and then to take that into making mental health better by learning from all diverse perspectives and disciplines. So it's sort of what we got ourselves into in the best of ways, and it just calls for different people from different disciplines.
Please, yeah, love to hear what you want to add on.
Yeah, just to add on to that, like June was saying, and at the Crown Institute too as well, with the research that we do, it's very collaborative. We are strong believers in working with communities, not working on communities, is a big part of our research. And like I was explaining earlier with the YPAR study in Mindful Campus, undergraduates were co-researchers on the team. So they weren't being studied on in that they were the population in which we were trying to serve, or they were co-researchers along the whole way. And so their expertise and their voices were very centered from the very beginning, from the foundation of what Mindful Campus is today.
Yeah, great. And you both shared so much on it. It was at the heart of your presentation, but it just curious if there's like another connection or colleague or project that you see that really the richness of interdisciplinary work.
Yeah, I mean, I think as researchers, like, we love to learn, right? That's why we do what we do, and so, and different people are so passionate and good at different things, and I love learning from new people and trying to understand how my interests and my developing expertise might work alongside someone else's with the mission that June spoke about earlier of just like, how can we use all of our various strengths to make the world a slightly better place, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, I agree. I think it really comes down to scientific humility in a sense, where no one researcher can be expected to hold the knowledge base to kind of respond to the challenges we're facing right now. And we just need just a much broader network of support.
Right. Well, the audience is definitely ready. We have some great questions that have come in online, and I know we'll probably have great questions here. So not everyone has to answer each one, and we'll see how many questions we can get through. But for the panelists, what is a suggestion that you can give to under-resourced Colorado residents struggling with unmet mental health needs? And thank you to the person online who contributed this. Oh, so I think the question disappeared. I was going to repeat it, but if we're experimenting with an iPad tonight. Something, maybe it's a resource or an approach, or I know there's some resources that were shared for after the event, but something that you can suggest to Colorado residents who are struggling with unmet mental health needs.
Well, as a place to start, this isn't specific to Colorado, but when you find yourself unable to access kind of formalized resources, there are a lot of kind of free accessible resources, things like mindfulness resources, so things like Insight Timer, various apps, Headspace, Calm, and there are also actually really good evidence-based workbooks that are available that can help kind of walk you through some form of what would otherwise be kind of a traditional therapy, but kind of independently. So that's kind of a place to start, but it's not specific to Colorado.
And these are two of our very best clinical science PhD students here. So what they're saying, I would take very strongly. The only thing that one might add is that we're seeing a time where we're rapidly trying to disseminate. We've got these evidence-based treatments, and one of the biggest challenges is how to disseminate them to people who need them the most. So, yeah, leveraging some of these freely available resources. There's also resources like in periods of acute crisis. There's phone numbers to call. There's a new suicide crisis text chat line if the barrier of even picking up a phone feels like too much. So there are these places one can reach out in periods of acute distress. And then these other resources, as mentioned, that are freely available. I also think about the need for to disseminate the opportunity we learned during COVID of how powerful telehealth can be. We're just like the effort of getting out of your house and trying to get to treatment. Imagine you're working a job and you have kids, like that can present a really formidable barrier. So finding ways to also disseminate sliding scale telehealth resources is really a job we have to take on and make sure it's more widely available.
And there was a question that and this might be the hotline that you're referencing, but someone asked online, what were your thoughts on the National 988 Suicide Crisis Hotline, and is there a tie into that on campus? Is that the text hotline you were mentioning, June, or is that maybe different? Yeah.
That's different. So you can use that in Colorado. You can use that on campus. It's if you're in acute distress, it's a phone number, an alternative to other emergency numbers, and it's definitely in our protocols in the clinic and something that we talk about and recommend using. Hopefully, you never need to use it, but it's wonderful that it is an accessible resource.
Mm-hmm. And I want to note for everyone here tonight that we did take really intentionally with this issue and this conversation to look at research. So correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not sure how hands-on you are with patients. So if anything also feels too far afield and out of the realm of answering, we can move on with questions.
It's a great question, and I think all of our goal is to really balance and integrate both. So our graduate students, they're therapists and they're scientists and they're teachers all at once, and the goal is to try to integrate what we learn by working with people into the research and have that feedback to the work we do with our patients.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Do we have a question here? We could move to the audience. This is your opportunity to, I see a hand on this side to ask a question that you've been wondering or something new that came up tonight.
Hi, my name is Zoe. I'm an undergraduate student here. And I know a couple of you are studying the development of mental illnesses, and so I'm curious to know if you have any predictions based on your research of some mental health patterns we're going to start seeing in even younger kids, like elementary and middle school age children, who maybe didn't get to develop socially for at least a year.
That's a great question. I mean, I can speak, obviously we're kind of in the early days of when COVID hit in the long-term sense. I can speak clinically, we see a lot more social anxiety, even among kind of college students. So, you don't have to be really young to be experiencing that. I think the social isolation was just really impactful for people, and there was just so much stress. And so that's one thing I think we're seeing is a lot of increased apprehension about social situations and meeting new people and speaking publicly and things of that nature.
Mm-hmm. I think something unique with COVID is that it's still, we're out of some parts of it, but we're still in some parts of it too. And people have chosen to start parenting differently based on it, and so I think the long-term effects of, I took your question to mean more in like the 3 to 5 range. What can we think about when kids go off to elementary school? Can they socialize with their peers the same? And I just think there are certainly groups doing that. I'm not an early developmental researcher, and so I can't speak directly to that. But even just anecdotally, I think we're about to see pretty significant changes in, like Amelia was saying, socialization or social anxiety and social comfort. And I'm also curious to see what happens with more elementary age students or children. Do you do any of that research, Jen?
Well, speaking as a psychologist, but also a parent of young children, it's been interesting both anecdotally hearing teachers talk about the cohort of children who they called kind of the COVID cohort of children, and how they'll remark in classrooms, I have a kindergartner and second grader, how they see different kinds of socio-emotional challenges in these kids on a whole that are unique. One of the pieces of research that I've been attuned to and paying attention to is what it's been like for children who went through a period of wearing masks. And we know in the face, so we do this coding, the facial action coding system of muscles in the face, and how we learn to recognize emotions in others and communicate them. And it was sort of this forced experiment in what happens to kids who lose that information in their day-to-day interactions at a young age. And so we're seeing some research now looking at building kind of emotion recognition skills in children, of reading the faces of their peers, the faces of their teachers, sort of reinforcing and relearning these really basic cues that help them know when a peer is upset and how to communicate that to them, because it was a source of information, really interestingly, not intended, but that they might have missed out on. So it's analyses underway, but it's something I think a lot about is a little bit of the unknown, what that will mean. I think in terms of kind of early warning signs, I was just going to say this is more of a general piece, but one of the things we don't often pay enough attention to is sleep. There's this beautiful book called Why Sleep Matters by Matt Walker at Berkeley. And working in a sleep lab, we learned that some of the earliest warning signs or precursors before the onset of something like mania or depression was like a shift in someone's sleep patterns. The things that we often, especially in the US, kind of push aside or, relegate to like secondary status of importance are the things that sometimes change the earliest, and that we need to pay careful attention to if someone is suddenly sleeping less, but saying that they're feeling adequately rested, or someone's noticing they're having a harder time getting to sleep or staying asleep or waking up too early, these kind of different domains that fall under insomnia, or they're sleeping much more than is normal. Now, we all probably sleep a little less than we ought to, but we're talking when people are going 10, 12 hours and still feeling rather sleepy. So we need to pay really close attention to sleep and also promote better sleep hygiene habits. It's argued as one of the biggest public health crises, and we know one of the key symptoms and early warning signs of many of our common mental health disorders.
Thank you, June. Courtney, did you want to add anything, or?
I would just add to the social anxiety piece that you were sharing, and I would say that, again, like you were saying earlier, I think that also appears not just as adults. I know for me, it's been a shift coming back like in person into working person versus just working from home. And so I can definitely feel that shift myself. And I know I've talked to other colleagues who also feel that just anxiousness of being in a space with so many people. And so.
Yes, we have a question here in the audience.
Okay, so I've been in healthcare a long time, as you can tell by my age. My name's Hans Wick. I'm a retired healthcare executive, a hospital CEO. I'm a pharmacist still. I have my license. And I had lunch today even with a primary care physician who had a full-time licensed clinical social worker in his office for helping his patients who have mental health issues, whether depression or anxiety. And my comment and question to you is, why can't we be more proactive than reactive? And what I mean by that is we don't treat mental health like we do physical health. Everybody who has a diabetic gets a blood glucose test, and it's very quickly to diagnose. And I'm wanting to see us start getting research through the destigmatization and everything else when we talk about it, so it's a normal part of our conversation that everybody can experience anxiety and depression. And so a lot of people don't even have a primary care physician, but we ought to be doing routine screening, the PHQ-9s, the GAD-7s for anxiety and depression, so it becomes a normal part of the conversation. And there's nothing bad about it except to say that it can happen to you, and then we can get people treatment rather than developing into crisis, because once it becomes a crisis, then we all pay for it. So any research that we can do to make this a normal part of people's conversation, because it happens, and just let people know it's okay. We can be proactive and get you help.
Yeah, I'm going to try to recap that a little bit for the audience online. The question was about, what can we do to move from being reactive to proactive in addressing mental health? How can we be using diagnostic tests and questions as similar? I think the comparison was made to, when we know someone has diabetes, we're screening for diabetes. It's very normalized. So if any one of you would like to comment on that, maybe something you're seeing about that, moving into a proactive versus reactive approach.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, do you can go first. I think you're preaching to the choir. I think we all really agreed on that one. I heard sort of two parts to your question, one being, why can't we be more proactive rather than reactive? And then sort of, how can we destigmatize, or what sorts of things can we do to facilitate this becoming more a part of routine care? And I'll address the second part first. I've actually seen more anecdotally, there's no research behind this, but I think people in the current college-age population are more willing to speak about mental health. It seems to be more a part of mainstream conversation, almost to the point where I have to say in some of the classes I teach, like, I can't know that much right now. Like, I'm not in a place to be able to provide you care immediately. And so I think also, I'm forgetting your name, but the first comment after when this Q&A started, I think you said, kind of a positive that came out of COVID was that now I would feel, if COVID happened again, I would feel more comfortable talking about it. And that made me feel so happy that that's how you feel now, because that's such a positive that's come out of something that's been largely, quite negative and isolating. And so I'm hoping that the destigmatization is already sort of underway. In terms of being more proactive rather than reactive and making it analogous to the medical, like more physical medical conditions, I think it's difficult because we still don't understand what the warning signs of different mental health conditions looks like as concretely as we do something like a glucose test. And so that's part of what Amelia was talking about with precision medicine. Can we better understand what some of those early warning signs are? Because depression is something that's so broad. And so to say, well, what's the warning sign of depression is really difficult, because depression means so many different things to so many different people and probably has so many different causes. And so I think we need to back up a little bit and do more work on understanding who and why psychiatric disorders come to be in a more sort of specific, nuanced sense than maybe the current DSM allows us to, the diagnostic manuals allow us to, and then really go into saying, okay, well, how can we take some of these more objective tests and make them more routine so that when you're at your annual checkup, you are getting the PHQ-9 and the G87. Very impressive that you know those terms too. And so, yeah, that was sort of my long spiel. Do you have anything to add?
Thank you.
I think the only thing I would add to that is there's system-wide barriers to more proactive care in mental health. I mean, I'm not an insurance expert, but my understanding is if you want your insurance to cover your therapy, you need some kind of diagnostic label to be affixed to that. And so that makes it hard to be proactive and catch people before they develop really, really clinically significant symptoms, because they almost by definition have to already be kind of having really significant symptoms.
The only thing I would add is that there's hope on the horizon. So in conversations with APA, the American Psychological Association, we've got a great chief science officer that is using this wonderful metaphor of thinking about, the dental hygiene visits, right? We try to ideally spend most of our time going for checkups and cleanings and not simply waiting until there's that tooth that needs to be pulled or that crown that needs to happen, and to adopt a similar model in many ways to routine dental care, to mental health care as well. And they're really moving forward, speaking, with Biden and others to really change and reform policy towards that end. So you're right on the pulse of exactly where we're trying to get.
Hi there.
Thank you, yeah.
I'm Teresa Cizurek. I'm a CU graduate and a serial technology entrepreneur. I wanted to make a couple of points. Just one in terms of this idea of diagnosis. You know, it doesn't only have to be in the medical community. I have seen like the Boulder County Mental Health Department coming out and like to my church doing a workshop to train members on mental health checkup. And they actually had quite a rigorous program of, training us on what to look out for. And actually, Rotary, I'm a member of, we have had workshops on, awareness of suicide symptoms and prevention. So I think it has to be much broader than just the medical community. But my other question has to do with taking the research and moving it into the curriculum, into teaching. And, are there new courses defined, or bringing some of this into the coursework? Are there new certificates? How are we here in Boulder coordinating with Anschutz and some of the other parts of CU? Because I know we don't have a public health school here. So, not yet. Big questions.
Not yet, I heard June say.
I mean, where to begin? I think there's been, Amelia and Elisa alluded to some wonderful kind of implementations of courses along the way. There is some conversations about a public health major along the lines of what you alluded to, that there's a lot of support and excitement for. And then there's some really lovely individual courses that are bringing in like these evidence-based strategies on the one hand of like mindfulness-based practices into the core curriculum, and other courses, that we've mentioned that are like, how do we take what we know about the kind of science of happiness and teach it to our students? I see Ethan here, he's in the class, but actually use it as a way to learn about the science and take science into practice, right? And sort of learn how to utilize those in your daily life. And I think it's that translation of science to classroom that is a key priority here on campus, and people have a lot of excitement about. I don't know if you wanted to say more, but there's a lot of like, that's where a lot of the new curriculum development, I think, is heading.
Mm-hmm. Courtney, I think your work is also taking it beyond the classroom, but on campus. Maybe if you have something that you want to add to this?
Yeah, I would add, so outside of our study, we also have our Mindful Campus program, 8-week series as we call it. And so with this program, we have different cohorts. So we have cohorts that could be just for undergraduates, or we have cohorts that could be for faculty members or community members, et cetera. And so I think that's one way we're, again, trying to come together, use these mindfulness-based practices that have been evidence-based, and bring them to the teachers as the teachers and the students, the whole campus culture, or the whole campus community interact with each other. So I think it's really important that it's not just students who are coming and getting these resources or talking and working together, but it's different people. It's, administrators, faculty, staff, et cetera.
Okay, another question? Me? Yes, please, yeah. We've got time for one or two more questions.
Hi, I'm Michelle Simpson, faculty member, Crown affiliate. I'm just curious, once upon a time, work that was done in laboratories, work that was done in institutes, Crown exception, Crown is the exception, I must say. So outside of that, the work often in communities of color was suspect, because all of the people doing the research look the same. All of the cohorts being studied were the same, with a few exceptions. White women got in there kind of slowly but surely, but most of the subjects or the research subjects were white men. And so when you were looking at research results, you were looking at results for white men. You were not looking at other communities. So my question to all of you would be what you're doing to reshape that.
So I'm going to restate that just in case it didn't get caught online. But the question from the audience member was, and who's a Crown Institute faculty member, was to address what are you and your research colleagues doing to address equity and representation, like racial and gender representation in research.
I'll start.
Please, yeah.
So at the Crown Institute, outside of the Mindful Campus program, I also work on the Girls Like Us program. So this program has collaborative members, and one of our missions, like Michelle was saying, is working with Boulder Valley School District, that's a hard one, and Black adolescent girls in these high schools. They're also a part of our research team at the Crown Institute. Again, they are co-researchers with us, working with the community. Some of our research involves looking at how to combat resistance to appearance biases, other things like that as well. And so I would say, I can speak from the Crown Institute, that that's some of the work we're really trying to incorporate by working with our communities together and
involving them, asking them. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think you're right, this is a huge problem. And not only has research, especially psychology research, not been by or for people of color, it's often directly harmed people of color. And I think there's a lot of trust that needs to be earned and rebuilt. And so I think, at least speaking for myself, this is something that I'm kind of working on an individual level in trying to really learn kind of anti-racist clinical practices, trying to kind of find more coursework, trying to integrate other perspectives into my training to really build that. And then at a lab level, it looks like trying to be more inclusive in our research practices, trying to increase accessibility to participate in research by offering, running research studies at different times and trying to recruit from a really broad swath of the community instead of just, exactly as you talked about, particularly white men, and trying to just really expand who's participating in the research process so a variety of voices are heard. But it's an ongoing, something that is very much iterative and ongoing.
I mean, just to echo everything Amelia said, you know, I think it's changed the very fundamental nature of the questions we ask. So, you know, we're now doing projects that are explicitly focused on, like, looking at the role of, you know, for example, cultural values on collective convivialism among Latinx communities, and really understanding the role that shapes in how people process emotions, how that affects their mood difficulties. Luisa, again, sorry to keep calling you out in the audience, like, we've been thinking about these questions with our collaborators in Brazil, right? And looking at it both within Brazilian young adults and kind of more urban communities and among quilombolas communities, and shaping the questions we ask and shaping who we get to hear from to help us learn truly about, in our case, mood disorders, but I feel like we've learned a very small subset about what mood disorders are, exactly as you said, among white participants, and it's time to move beyond that, and it's time to really ask the questions that matter, and that matter for everyone. So that's really been the forefront of now, really the thread of all we're trying to do, and realizing we have more to do and more to learn as well. So just echoing what you're saying.
Thank you, Dr. Gruber.
We have one more question up here.
Okay, great.
Hi, my name's Teresa. I'm a community member, and as a part of the group of young adults emerging from COVID, specifically young adults who have experienced mental illness in youth and in teenage life, I have emerged as now a mental health, hopefully professional, and am kind of crossing that threshold. And so I think that for good reason, young adults and adolescents have been focused on heavily in research and in kind of the coming out, how do we come out the other side of COVID? And I think that that is for good reason. But I am working on creating a holistic wellness business for teens and seniors, because I think that there are other groups and other populations, you guys mentioned a little bit about minorities, other groups and other populations that don't have the concrete resources that young adults on a college campus might have. So my question for you is, how do we walk away from conversations like this where we're learning specifically about young adults and then address greater populations that might not have the resources that young adults have?
So I think the question centers on how do we take what we're learning tonight. A lot of the research and talk has been focused on campus needs and work within campus communities, and how do we extrapolate and expand that to communities in need who aren't part of CU or part of a college campus?
I think, oh, I'm
Please.
so sorry.
No, go for it.
I think that's a really good and interesting question that also has me thinking about as well for people who may not have access to technology as easily like we may here on campus. And so I wonder if part of that potential solution would be just with communication and with talking with our different communities. And so I think still talking about mental health and sharing stories, talking with who you're around, who you work with, family, friends, all of that. But I wonder about other resources that may be potentially helpful and easier to reach for people who are on campus or have those technology resources. So I'm curious what y'all think.
It makes me think just Wi-Fi access, right? Depending on where you are in the world or the country, and you have high-speed Wi-Fi and landlines on campus, and that's a barrier to telemedicine, for example. Yeah.
And the very places where telemedicine is hardest to access are also the places where there's often not as much in-person care either.
Yeah. Other ideas? Yeah? Seems like you have one.
Well, I think it's a great question. I learned from Amelia yesterday, actually, that age and, sociability and social circle, actually, Jean, you might know about this too, and quality of life is positively correlated. And so I'm thinking about when we're talking about aging populations in particular, making sure that there are community resources to have a social circle and a social network being really important, even outside of this diagnostic clinical sort of arena. We're providing a lot of, we're agreeing with you and not providing a lot of solutions, I'm recognizing.
But I think the thread from the beginning through now is how necessary it is to normalize and socialize the conversation from communities in rural areas to maybe elderly communities to the communities on campus, that part of the goodness of the momentum is just having more and more conversations so that people can talk about solutions. We don't have all of them tonight, but I just want to say, I think on behalf of everyone, it's been such a pleasure to hear so much about your research. Thank you for sharing your time and your expertise. It is time to wrap up the event, and I do have some notes to make sure that folks know everything that's available to them, because our presenters shared a lot of resources, and they'll also be here afterward. So there will be a QR code that you can scan and find more resources, and we've worked together collaboratively to organize those into 3 categories: give more, learn more, and engage more. So for Give More, you can give directly to the research that our presenters are working on: the Positive Emotion and Psychopathology Lab, Research on Affective Disorders and Development Fund, Inside You, which is here tonight, and the Renee Crown Wellness Institute. For Learn More, you can learn more about the research and programs that our presenters are involved in, including a research paper that Dr. June Gruber has shared, and that's on mental health during COVID-19. We have a TED Talk by Dr. Rosie Kaiser, who I think Amelia and Alyssa work with. And let's see, and more on, and more on Girls Like Us and Mindful Campus. Those are 2 of the additional programs. So, and then for Engage More, you can engage with this topic by participating in Dr. Gruber's Coursera course, participating in the RAD Lab, or using any of the Crown Institute's resources. So for those of you who are attending tonight, I hope that you will stay and talk more with our researchers. And for those of you who are online, thank you so much for joining us. We will be sending out resources after the event. You'll get a full video of the event, and each of the talks from the presenters will also be shared out. And once again, thank you, presenters, for your time. And thank you, all of you, for joining us for Coloradan Conversations. We'll see you next time. Thank you.